Hello everyone, my name is Andrew and welcome back to Frames of Space. One of the things that I've always tried to do with this podcast is to take a very wide view of modern politics. Be very broad when it comes to understanding all the different perspectives and all the different political coalitions and how all of that has coalesced or changed over time. After all, it's not just about where we are, but also how we got here. And it's also about the stories that might still get us out of this mess. You see, today, we are diving into a conversation that's been on my mind for a while now, one that's about more than just politics. It's about stories, participation, and the future of liberalism in America. And that brings me to my guest today, Marshall Kosloff. Marshall is a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center and the host of the podcast, The Realignment, which is one of the most widely followed podcasts in the political space. The Realignment chronicles the ideological and institutional changes that have reshaped the political parties on both the left and the right. But Marshall isn't just an analyst of the right. He has lived it. He started his career on the right, working with and interviewing many of the same people who now staff the Trump administration. That proximity, well, it gives him a very unique vantage point today. After all, he has seen how MAGA populism has come to dominate the GOP, and he understands why it continues to command the loyalty of voters in a way that mainstream liberalism hasn't been able to do for years. Marshall has been in the rooms where it happened. He's interviewed the key players, and he's watched MAGA politics evolve, not just as a cult of personality, but also as a unique narrative structure. And that is one of the key points that we explore in this episode, which is that of storytelling. On the American right, if you were to ask both highbrow national conservatives and lowbrow online influencers, they would all have one tactical advantage over the left, which is that they know how to tell a very clear and very emotionally compelling story. It's a story that's morally unambiguous and simple enough that you don't need a college degree to repeat it to your friends. I've spent a lot of time thinking about the dearth of stories within Democratic Party politics today. We often obsess over how policy gets made, but we often also forget to tell people why it should matter to them. There is a tension between crafting the best policies and failing to communicate why they're important. And that's something that I think about a lot. And it's a big part of the discussion today. But maybe the most important part of this conversation is about action. You see, after the 2024 election, Marshall started getting flooded with emails from listeners asking quite sincerely what they could do to help out with the situation. And unfortunately, he didn't have a good answer. Not because people weren't motivated, not because there wasn't a groundswell of support from people who wanted to do something, but unfortunately, there were no real containers for that motivation. No organizations, no communities, no clear paths for participation beyond just protest. So that's what this conversation is really about. What it would take to build that capacity for liberal participation once again. How do we rebuild liberalism, not just as an ideology or a coalition, but as a movement that gives people something that they can belong to? That is the driving question. So let's dive in. This is a conversation about stories, about action, and about the future of liberalism in America. I really hope you enjoy it.
Hey, how's it going, dude?
I'm doing well, and I hope that you're doing the same.
Yeah, no, and we're here.
Yeah, well, I just for the record, to those of you who are listening, I'm I'm still giving this person the cold shoulder because technically he agreed to come on to my podcast like 2 years ago, and it took until now until I could actually get him on.
Well, Andrew, there's a lesson here. I know you've been doing some work with people with their podcasts. You have to be persistent and not take anything personally.
Yeah, but maybe I could take it personally if it makes for a more interesting discussion.
Well said.
Yeah. Are you ready?
Yes.
Marshall Kosloff, thank you so much for finally coming onto this podcast and not like ducking my email for like the 31st time.
2 years in the making.
All right. First question. Could you explain why you made the really foolish decision to get rid of the really cool intro music that your podcast used to have?
You are the third person today who said that to me. And the actual true answer is that my podcast producer my former podcast producer is the sibling of a prominent member of the Trump administration. So people can look this up if they want to figure out who I'm talking about. And when he left in January, I also had a baby. So my editing capabilities, Descript, is really great. It gets me 95% of the way there doing it myself. But I have not figured out how to do smooth intro and outro music. So now that I'm Niskanen, I'm going to get an actual editor who will bring the music back.
Yeah, maybe I could, if I, like, this is the part where I wish that I had some kind of like sponsorship with like a podcast editing program that I could use to like make money by like adding a seamless ad in here, but alas. All right, so maybe it's just time to introduce yourself to people who are just like listening and being like, who the hell is this person and why are we talking? Okay, so like, explain a little bit about your own podcast. Like, could you talk a little bit about how your podcast started and how it sort of changed over time?
Yeah, so the who the hell am I thing is particularly relevant for this podcast because I do so many different things across so many different worlds that on one call, people will say that I'm a lib. And then later that day, I'll be talking to folks at a DC think tank and they'll assume that I'm on the right. So here's what I do. So my name is Marshall Kosloff. I am the host of the Realignment podcast, and I'm also a senior fellow and director of special projects at the Niskanen Center. So the Realignment came about in 2019. I'd worked at PBS on the reboot of William F. Buckley's Firing Line of Margaret Hoover, and it was really cool working at PBS. But I think as we're seeing with the Jimmy Kimmel stuff, there's a lot of debate about like traditional TV versus digital and the internet. And it just became pretty clear to me that while Firing Line was a great show, if you're kind of trying to bring new ideas to new generations, you wouldn't do that at 8:30 p.m. on Friday nights on PBS. You would do that on the internet. So I got together with my not quite famous at that point best friend from college, Sagar and Jetty, and we got a little bit of money to launch the Realignment at the Hudson Institute, a conservative traditional think tank, which is where the sort of where does Marshall sit ideologically kind of stand in. But the Realignment was on the right when it started because if you think of post-2016, all of the interesting discussions in American politics, aside from just the day-to-day news, they're all on the right. So what is the future of conservatism? How is Trump changing populism? What does it mean that he's taking new stands on entitlements, the Iraq war, all these big questions? Our first guest was J.D. Vance before he was a senator, before he was vice president. So spent a lot of time there. And then over time, I kept doing the Realignment, took it to the Foundation for American Innovation. Sagar went to Breaking Points, and gradually over this 6-year period, just because when you interview so many people, I've done more than 600 interviews, you sort of start to sort of change and sort of get your perspective sort of refocused. And where I've really ended up as a podcaster, but also just a person who thinks about things, is I'm like heterodox center left. The way I kind of put this, I was describing this to folks on a call earlier today. I'm probably the most populist, establishment-coded person you could basically run with. So I work at think tanks, I do CFR events, but I'm always still going to be really sympathetic with like left and right populists in a way that isn't really normal for a Niskanen world.
All right, so maybe you would describe yourself as a populist who nevertheless uses like sort of establishment language that like people who work in think tanks in DC, like, they can like, because like I noticed that like when I listen to your podcast, sometimes it feels like it's for very politically engaged people who know all the like the insider baseball rhetoric that we're familiar with. Are you like trying to basically find a way to like do some kind of Nixon goes to China thing about like introducing populism to like people who are normally squares when it comes to politics?
Great question. I think that it's not that I'm a populist in the establishment. It's that I am a person in this establishment. And by the way, the establishment is not cool. Like, this isn't meant to be braggy. It's actually kind of, if you're saying I'm from the establishment and I'm here to help right now, that's not a leading indicator of success in the podcasting or any other world. But no, I think it's really just that I work at think tanks. I work in the university system. I work in all of these. I worked at PBS, right, to my intro. I worked in all of these different institutions that have been under assault for the past 10 years plus, that have lost trust over the past 40 years plus. And I think that one of the reasons why these institutions have really struggled to reform themselves or actually operate in this new environment is they have just not done a good enough job reckoning with the good faith and useful populist-sided critiques. So, not a populist myself, it's not my personality, but I'm like really personality level sympathetic with populism, right? Like, I'm someone who looks at this system, looks at our politics, looks at our different policy choices, like looks at the sort of lives that people experience today and just say, oh, wait, I get why you'd be pissed off and why these different, very comfortable, very Sala corridor coastal places aren't really a source of what you think the solution is going to be for making your life better.
All right. So then, yeah, walk me through that a little bit. So, like, you mentioned that, like, you used to be on the right and now you're more like center left. Were there any, like, defining moments over the past few years that caused your ideology to shift, or was it just like a gradual process that's not interesting to talk about on a podcast?
No, there are a couple events. So, event number one would frankly just be January 6th. I know that's not sexy. I know it's like very obvious, but the thing is, during the first iteration of the realignment discourse in 2018, 2019, there was this really optimistic, hopeful POV on it, especially when you focused on sort of the left populists and right populists. So the take was, oh, wow, the neoliberal post-1980s status quo has all these different problems with it. And what's going to happen is after Trump has risen and after Bernie did so on the Democratic primary, you're going to see left populists and right populists in a horseshoe supersede that establishment that's failed and build a better politics. That's why you saw during this 2018, 2019 period, lots of conversations about like, wow, Josh Hawley, senator from Missouri, young rising Republican, he's interested in antitrust. And Matt Stoller of the American Economic Liberties Project is a huge fan of him. That's so different. That's so new. You had all these people on the right talking about how Trump was pushing the party, despite being more socially conservative on certain questions, especially like immigration. He was opening up the Republican Party to gay marriage. He was moving slightly to the center, at least when it came to rhetoric around those different topics. So there was just this view that the realignment was going to be this positive force that would realign the economics of our country. What we saw of January 6th onwards was a realization that the realignment wasn't going to be this hunky-dory economic populism. Everyone gets health care. All the union workers get all their labor rights. We're reindustrializing the country. It's good to go. Instead, we saw cultural division. Instead, we saw that the same populist distrust that led the Republican Party to get overthrown and really put pressure on the Democratic Party via Bernie Sanders also led to a situation where people wanted to tear things down, and not in a productive way, not in a helpful way, but in a really destructive one. So that forced me to take the idea of the realignment, which I think a lot of people fall in love with, and separate that with the actual one. And then the last thing, and this is why I'm going on here for a second, but I think it really matters. This is why I brought up during the beginning of the podcast how something I'm really frustrated by is how people within center-left establishment world really like describing me as a conservative. When if you talk to anyone on the center-right rightwards, they would say Marshall's a huge lib. Marshall's not a conservative. He works in Niskanen and does CFR events. And I think part of what's attracted a lot of people on the center left to describe me as a conservative is that during this realignment era, where there's always really difficult dynamics to get around, it's convenient to think that I represent the future of the conservative movement, that I'm this like reasonable suburban living, establishment friendly person, when actually like I don't represent the right in any way. I think I could channel the right. I think I understand their perspectives, and I'm like really sympathetic with huge parts of the right, but I'm not a conservative. And I think that's really what January 6th really set into real accord.
Yeah. So before my next question, I will say that January 6th was a formative experience for me as well. I think it was disappointing to just see how little the median American actually cared about those events, but I digress. Anyway, so obviously you're not a conservative in terms of like where the actual conservatives are in this country, but if you can channel conservatism, if you can like sort of like be better at understanding it than like the average Democrat is, maybe that's a product of all the years that you spent working with the American right, what you say?
Yeah, totally. And this is something where a lot of my critiques of the center left come from. So the thing the right does really, really well is tell stories that are either super highbrow or super lowbrow about both the conservative movement and also where the country is right now. So if you spend any time in a right-wing space, the key vibe, literally and like metaphorically, that you'll pick up is, wow, the country, the West, the general state of the world right now is a total disaster. All of the people who caused that disaster are associated either with the center consensus after the 1990s, or are center-right moderate conservatives, or are the left of center, or are the left in the case of social cultural questions like Black Lives Matter. And the answer to both the disaster where our country is ended up right now and to how terrible all the leaders I just cited are is to overthrow this system and advance MAGA. Make America great again. Go back, not just to sort of like this hypothetical past. I don't like when people just say nostalgia is vapid, but actually just say we used to have a different vision of how things would work in this country. And the more we moved away from the vision, the worse things got. So that is the number one vibe you pick up in right-wing spaces. And when you go to any center-left space, what's very, very frustrating is if you were to ask them some version of, okay, so that's the MAGA story. The left populists also have a story too, right? They were since the 1980s and since the end of the New Deal order, our country's becoming increasingly focused on capital. Everything's financialized, income inequality, and that's the center of everyone's torment right now. The left populists would have something to say. But if you speak to actual center-left Democrats, they basically don't have really much to say anymore. I think there was a story that you could tell if you were on the center-left. So the story was, of course, the emerging Democratic majority. The country's getting more diverse. As it gets more diverse, we move in a more positive direction. The arc of the universe bends towards moral justice, all those different things. Ezra Klein did a great podcast with Ross Douthat last week where he said that a big problem for center-left liberalism is that in many ways, Barack Obama's election as president was the culmination of the project he just articulated. And after that was over, people kind of didn't really know what to do or say. And part of the reason why abundance, which we'll get into a bit later, became so relevant despite not supposed to be the central story of liberalism is because there was just such a void that the first entrant filled it. So when I just go to center left spaces, like my dream for these spaces is that in the next 2 years, you'll have actual leaders and institution builders or just actual politicians, activists, normal people, whatever, who are able to say like, hey, here's where the country is right now. Here's a story of how we got here, and here's a story of how we got out of there. And then after you develop that story, both the beginning, the middle, and the end, then you come up with policy. Then you find leaders who could be adjacent with that story, and that's how you politically succeed.
Yeah, there's so much that I could like. There are like 5 different tangents I could go on, but I'll go on a few of them, please. I'll stick with 2. So the first thing is that I remember having a conversation with one of my friends over the summer where he said something that kind of stuck with me, which is that like his interpretation is that like the rise of like the Obama era coalition ended up being a net negative for the Democratic Party because it caused them to overestimate just how popular a lot of progressive, especially socially progressive cultural norms and policies would be for the country at large. I think that people underestimated how much like minorities or like working class voters would be on board with a lot of the stuff that like elite progressives wanted. And they didn't realize that part of the reason why so much of it was fine during the Obama era was just like a unique product of Obama's appeal rather than all the other stuff that was associated with it. So that's the first tangent. The second tangent, I think when you mentioned that like people need to be better at telling a story, there's this like concept in business where I think that a lot of the time, the people that are the worst at marketing the products that they want to market are the ones that are marketing the vehicle rather than the destination. So I'm going to go with the most literal example of that metaphor would be like, let's say that you want to go to vacation in the Bahamas and like you're trying to sell people like a plane ticket to go on a plane to the Bahamas. You wouldn't sell them like this has like the best seats and like the safest plane ride and like the best technology on the plane and all that yada yada yada. You would sell them the whole idea about how cool it would be to go to vacation in the Bahamas, and then as a result, like this plane will take you to that destination. I think that I think this is something that I mentioned in one of my previous podcasts with Steve Tellis, who I know you've talked with pretty often, but something that I find really both fascinating and somewhat not concerning, but definitely like an issue that needs to be addressed is that like we're really, really, really good at talking about the intricacies of policies that we don't really recognize that we're discussing how to make the vehicle as best as possible. And we haven't found a way to like sell actual average voters on the destination that we're intending to bring them to. So those are the two tangents that I wanted to get on. Feel free to...
Quick question, and here's a question for you. So I'm curious, in this metaphor, which I love, what is the vehicle? So is the vehicle like a candidate or the Democratic Party? I'm just curious what you think about that.
The vehicle is for people to feel a sense of safety and stability in their own lives. So I'm just gonna repeat myself. Something that I told to Steve Tellis is that like there's a difference between the way that like upper middle class establishment figures, there's a difference between the way that people like us view poverty and the ways that actual poor people view poverty. Like we would view poverty as like an economic thing of like, you're below this one rung of the economic ladder, therefore you don't make this much money, and therefore you're not able to afford XYZ. Whereas like, if you actually talk to poor people about how poverty feels like, they would describe it not in economic terms, but in psychological terms. They would describe it as like a lack of like safety, a lack of stability, a lack of agency, and just like this constant sense of despair and hopelessness. And like, if we solve for poverty, we would solve it by figuring out all the economic data that would allow them to like have higher levels of real income or nominal income or whatever. But like the destination that we're trying to sell them is to feel that sense of safety and that sense of security and the ability to have a greater agency over their life. And I think that there's something similar with the abundance discourse where we're trying to perfect the vehicle about how to make housing as affordable as possible and how to make clean energy as abundant as possible. But like we should be better at selling people like the end goal, which is like the psychological state that we want them to feel, which is similar to the psychological state that we want poor people to feel when we lift them out of poverty. So that's what I wanted to say about this.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Do you ever wonder if like spending so much time in elite circles, spending so much time in like DC based think tanks has made it a lot harder for you to talk about politics in the ways that the median voter talks about politics?
100%. 100%. So what's actually interesting, because it's not just the language of politics. It's just like the reality of like when you're in DC and the relationship. So I don't write. And a friend of mine who's a president of a think tank said, the problem for you, Marshall, is that you can't be a writer because all of your best takes or POVs, you can't actually write down. You can't actually burn those bridges. You actually just can't insult these people. Your most incisive comments are always when you're going off the record, not when you're going on the record. So it's not just that. And I always found this like when I was on Breaking Points. So like I hosted Breaking Points. I took like a 2-year break from Breaking Points since I moved out to Austin, but I hosted it again in June. And it was funny to see the difference between hosting Breaking Points in 2025 versus 2022 as I sort of advanced in my career and had more responsibilities. Because when I'm talking on Breaking Points, I'm operating like at 65% capacity. Like I'm able to say 65% of what I want to say because I'm sort of like, okay, so if I say X thing about Mamdani, then how will that reflect on like my institution? And there's this other institution. And then actually, by the way, I'm trying to book this guest for the podcast who's going to be an awkward. So you just have to do certain things if you're playing that game. And to a certain degree, what makes Sagar so much better of a pundit than I am is the fact that if you watch him, and you'll see me in awe of him as I'm sitting by him sometimes, he'll just look at a camera and just say 120% of what he believes. And there's just basically not a public forum where I feel comfortable doing that. And I think that's true with all of us in like most of our lives, right? You don't actually, like, let's say you're at work, right? Because I don't want to make this seem like this is just like politics is so unique. Like if you're at work, you don't actually, if you're in a meeting and, okay, this is a good way to put this, given your metaphor. Let's say you're in a meeting with the marketing team talking about how like they're selling the vehicle you're describing earlier. If you're like a mid-level person in this big meeting and you're seeing the big CEO over focus on the vehicle and not the destination, you're not actually going to raise your hand and say, actually, that's wrong. 100%. No, you're going to find like a 40% moderated version. Maybe you ask your supervisor for a second follow-up. That's how working in DC politics is. But when you're in like media commentary, especially in independent media, the whole point of independent media is Sagar, Crystal, all these people, they get paid not by an institution. They don't go to big fancy events where they need to MC things like I MC'd the Abundance Conference. They're not doing CFR events like I did at Endless Frontiers. They're just on their own. So they need to make people happy. They need those 100 to 120% takes all the time. So it's really difficult to, I think, talk about these issues in that context. But also, I think, too, like to your point, long answer to your question, but I was trying to answer this from a couple of perspectives. But I also think, too, like, it is harder to talk about issues of people because DC is just very like wonk driven, especially in like center left spaces. Like everything's about like how wonky you are. So it does like make it harder. But I will say that like being out here in Austin, not that Austin's like the boonies or anything, but just because most of my friends don't work in politics, like I've gotten better at just like talking about things sort of like, hey, like, so for example, when I pitch the abundance agenda to people, it's basically like, hey, like think about it this way. Our default POV as 30-something or late 20-something millennials is that like you're not able to purchase a house the way it used to be 30 or 40 years ago. And the abundance agenda is about making it so that actually there would be houses that you could purchase. We would build more starter homes. So you don't have to go all the way out, an hour out of the city to the exurbs, or you don't have to buy a 5-bedroom house if you're not ready. That's the way I kind of talk about it.
Yeah, and maybe the goal is to find some Democratic politician that is very good at selling the destination, but like using vocabulary that even like a fourth grader would be able to understand. So I have two more tangents that I want to go on. So the first one, you mentioned that like the more you work in politics, the more you learn to sort of weigh your words and not be forthright. You gave the analogy of like you're taught like you find some CEO and they're talking way too much about the vehicle and not the destination. If you want to push back against them, you sort of measure your words. I think you indirectly explained why a lot of Americans respect Donald Trump much more than the two of us might, because Donald Trump, even though I might consider him to be like an evil person, he at least has the courage to like yell at people if he disagrees with them in a ways that like tons and tons of like elite people in DC don't have the courage to do. So that's the first tangent I'm going to go on, but unfortunately I forgot what the second tangent was. So I'll just I'll let you froth off at the mouth until I remember what I was going to say.
No, that's very accurate. And it's something I'm thinking a lot about as I sort of look forward to my career, because I just went full time in Niskanen, is thinking about how public leadership and the performance of politics is going to have to change coming out of this political era. And I do think there is something to, let me put it this way, the Trump example you gave doesn't make me froth at the mouth, because I actually like, really respect that ability. I really respect his ability just to be very direct about his POV in a way that's like plain spoken in of itself. So like the funny thing is, so like you talked about like fourth grade words. I actually don't think the problem with your average Democratic politician is like the use of like 8th grade words versus 12th grade words versus the grad degree. I actually think the literal problem is just like the lack of being direct. Because in the spaces that you grow up in, especially if you're a center left politician who's sort of a front row kid going to an Ivy, going to a great school like McGill, like you did, you're just not taught to behave in a way that I think people really, really, really respond to. And especially like during a moment like this, where frankly, there is just a lot that like is bad. And this is, you know, I want to get like personal on this podcast with you, because I like know you a decent amount. It is like really frustrating, because like on a personal level, it's frustrating how I just see a lot of things that are obviously wrong. And actually, this is the defense of me versus Donald Trump, right? So like, I'm just like a podcaster, you know, mid-success, sort of trying to reach my peak in my late 30s. So I'm very okay with my timeline, but I don't actually have power, and there's no obvious thing I could do. Donald Trump has power, but like, as I think about like, okay, what is like 38, 39-year-old Marshall going to have to be able to do? Like, what do I need to work on over the next 5 to 6 years? It's just that ability to say like, hey, this is bad. This is dumb. I don't care if that situation is awkward or gets people mad at me. That's a skill set I want to develop. And I think a lot of people in my generation are going to have to develop.
You know, when we first started this recording, I was pretty pissed about like how long it took for you to come onto my podcast. But now, after you gave that story, I'm only slightly pissed at you. I'm not very pissed at you anymore. Yeah. So,
no, I'd like to. I'm glad that we waited 2 years. Not the rudeness of my lack of response, but I've honestly sort of, in sports, like a team will go through a rebuilding. I've been going, and people know this if they listen like religiously to my podcast. People have picked this up. Like I've been going through rebuilding the past few years since I moved to Austin, right? Like I, was in DC through 2021. I went to New York for a year. I worked in tech. I moved out to Austin, took my life in a totally different direction, became more institutionalist, like became less interested in sort of, I want to be like a independent content creator versus like, hey, I want to like lead a think tank, or I want to be like a leader in an institution. The version of me that you're getting now is different than the version you would have gotten 2 years ago. And I'm like very happy that the timing on this actually worked out.
All right. I'll accept that answer. Yeah. Okay. There's another thing. I earlier on, you talked about the difference between like one thing that the right is a lot better at is like being like movers and shakers and building a large movement, yada, yada, yada. But okay. So during your interview with Daniel Lee Thompson, you mentioned something that I thought was just extremely fascinating, which is like after the 2024 election, after Trump's second inauguration, all that jazz that I might consider to be like bad news, you got tons and tons and tons of emails from your own listeners basically asking you for advice about what they could do, how they could help out. And then you use that own personal experience to give a sort of difference about what the liberal establishment, like one of the disadvantages of the liberal establishment is that they don't really have as much for people to do compared to the conservative establishment. I thought that was a fascinating critique. Could you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah. So for quick context, so basically that was a great episode, by the way. It's my favorite episode that I've done in a long time. It's the episode that's gotten the best reviews out of the time. Danielle and I were talking, hopefully she could be more a part of the realignment moving forward. But after the self-referencing, I'll move on to your actual question. So yeah, what I was talking about is like after the 2024 election and after the inauguration, sort of like peak Trump in certain ways, peak vibe shift, a lot of people, not just sort of like everyday people, but actually people like high within Democratic Party politics, I would sort of like categorize all of these people as like, these are people who like could be like famous in like 10 years from now, like that sort of category of listener. And I just got a lot of emails saying like, okay, like what's the plan? What do I do? I was telling a specific example about how there is this like young professional from Philly who reached out, who was with, this person's an engineer at a big Fortune 500 company, and he was with his doctor friends and his lawyer friends. And they were all just like getting together as center-left people saying, hey guys, like, what do we do? And for me, that was just such a crazy, I think every single thing populists get right about the center-left establishment's flaws was encapsulated in this reality. And that I think there's a profound lack of belief, not in the sense of like, obviously everyone in the center left believes in democracy, but I think there's something important called like believing in like lowercase democracy, in the sense that like, let me put it this way. What I think is so cool about Zoran Mamdani and the populist left is that their projects are very inclusive. Join your DSA chapter, write for all these magazines we're listening, subscribe to my Substack. We have this like huge sway of like independent podcasts that are very listener driven and go on tours and have inside lingo. There is no one like big institution. So it's like very democratic in that sense, right? Like the example that Danielle talked about is like Zoran did the big scavenger hunt in New York City a few weeks back. And if a center left politician did this, people would have like dunked on her, said it was cringe, which is kind of like unfair. But like the reason why Zoran's version wasn't cringe is because it came from the ethos of the campaign. So they already had a really super participatory campaign. So then taking that to its logical conclusion with an event like made sense, versus let's imagine there's like a cursed centrist in a lab version of me who's just sort of like running, sees Zoran do that and says, hey, I'll come down to Austin, Texas. We're doing a scavenger hunt. That would be cringe because that'd be coming out of nowhere and obviously copying everything. And that like wouldn't work. But the thing is too, like the populist right, because the populist right was an insurgent movement, and because the right didn't have like, let's say, lots of like professionals and lawyers and doctors and engineers, they worked really, really hard to build spaces for them. So like a lot of people on the center left know about American Compass. This is Oregon Cass's group. Like this is a group where if you're a smart, young, right of center person interested in economics, you could join this group, and they have events and they have a podcast and they have a Substack. It's really, really, really great. I see nothing like this on the center left, and it's genuinely distressing. And I think genuinely reflects the fact that the center left is so just sort of rooted in DC and donors dictate everything, or there are people who have ideas for things like this, but their first question isn't like, okay, cool. So like, let's just do a meetup at a bar. It's like, okay, cool. So like, when we talk to these 5 funders that I know, maybe if they fund my like center left version of American Compass, we could then do this thing, which is the opposite of how the right populists and left populists do things. It's a real frustrating dynamic.
Do you think there's a difference between what left-wing funders allow and what right-wing funders allow in terms of like what they tell the people they're funding to do?
I don't think so. So no. So I will know, like I've had nothing but good experiences with like left and right funders. It's less about, this is a fascinating question because it gets very meta. It's less about what they specifically will do on a call saying, okay, I'm on the right, you have to do X, Y, or Z, or I'm on the left, you have to do X, Y, and Z. I've never found things to literally work that way. I'm sure there are parts of like donor world that operate that way on the left and right, but like I just like the good news about the intellectual spaces that like you and I swim in is it's just like a little different because there's a requirement of like academic seriousness. Like it's not like pay for play quite in that sense. I think political activism is a lot more complicated. It's something that I don't like engage in. But I think the difference in outcomes between left and right giving, I also talked about this on the episode of Danielle, is that the left of center space is hyper obsessed with like technocratic metrics and theories of change and this or that. Like lots of like plan out like your funding structure versus the right is much more, the right treats this much more like venture capital. So the right will tend to give, from what I've experienced, smaller amounts of money, but in a much easier way. So the example I gave on the podcast with Danielle is like the Realignment got funded because I got connected to a Republican donor. And I was like, hey, I work on firing line and I want to do a podcast about big ideas. He's like, cool, here's $50,000. So like, it's not a crazy amount. It funded one season. I didn't have healthcare, but it was enough to get started. And like, now I'm here now and it really works. Versus the left of center would have given a much bigger check, but they would have said, so what's the proof of like the way that you're going to be able to deliver metrics on this realignment? What's your theory of change? What are the outcomes? These are totally different scenarios that push people in different directions. The way I would kind of put this is that the rights model of funding is much more talent focused. It's much more like venture capital, where a lot of what you're doing is like, think of Peter Thiel's fund, Founders Fund. There's a lot in that name. The point of Founders Fund is that their actual thesis as a VC firm is that the founder is the core. So maybe your company is going to pivot, or maybe the Series A raise won't go as well as the Series B raise. Maybe the Series B won't go as well as the Series A, but it's really on the Series C that it's going to make a difference, because actually the founder is what really matters here. Palmer Luckey, Mark Zuckerberg, like these people are at the core of it. That is the right's model of funding. And it's not that they get this from VC. It's just because the way the right tells its story when it comes to the world of ideas is very personality based. So think of William F. Buckley. Charlie Kirk is someone who also like benefited from this dynamic. Like there's just this model that like on the right, you find like young, ambitious, hungry people, you give them a bit of funding and they run with things and they build movements. That is not the way that the left of center funding world works.
There's a part of me that's wondering if I should put my like over analysis hat on and try to connect the differences in funding with like differences in personality between liberals and conservatives in terms of like risk aversion or something.
No, you should do it. No, because can I tell you something? I got a lot of positive feedback from left of center people about me explaining this funding dynamic, because they were actually like, it is actually so important that left of center philanthropy learn from the way the right does things. That's obviously a much superior model. Because look, here's the real critique of left of center giving since the Trump era. What has it produced? Genuinely, like obviously there have been things that have really happened, and I'm not claiming the realignment's like this like crazy production, but I would say for like a $50K investment, I would put the realignment and the work it does and the space I'm building ahead of a lot of like far larger grants that left of center people gave during this period. So like, I would love for you to talk about like your theory of like how this is actually going on here.
All right, I really need to give you recommendations for like editing software. If you're literally just getting $50K for this, then I'm sure that like there's some software where you can just like plop in intro music and the AI will just sort out where to put. All right, but anyway, I think that the left is a lot more risk averse than the right is. I think part of it has to do with the fact that people on the left tend to be a lot more neurotic, and that neuroticism leads to like a greater desire to like dot every single I and cross every single T, even in circumstances where it's better to just like go crazy in ways that people on the right are a lot more willing to do. I think this also has to do with educational polarization a little bit, where the more educated you are, the more you become, like the more square you sort of become, where like I'm sure that we're trying to channel populist energy, but like I'm sure that even this specific recording, if we were to show it to like some median American who's not that plugged in, we would still sound like the establishment, just because like no matter how populist people, like highly educated people like me are, like you can never fully channel like the populist like sentiments of the median American, just because of how so disengaged we are from that, how much time we spend in like DC type like politics, and how much time we spend like listening to commentators like Ezra Klein or Derek Thompson or Steve Tellis. It's like it's impossible to avoid, and like every time we try to get a little bit closer, you sort of realize how large the chasm is, and how much of that, maybe part of that is a product of like the fact that the left is more neurotic. I do wonder if this is also connected to like a little bit of the gender divide in politics, where men tend to take risks a lot more than women, at least as the median man compared to the median woman. But I'm probably just drastically overanalyzing things at this point. Feel free to yell at me if you think.
I won't yell at you, but I will say, so several things. Like one, I haven't noticed a gendered difference in the dynamic I'm describing. So that's like number one. Two, I would say this also is an education polarization thing, because anyone will tell you this, like right of center philanthropy world tends to actually pick up the most like educated people on the American right, especially pre-Trump. So lots of Ivy Leaguers, lots of people with PhDs, lots of people with master's degrees, lots of lawyers. So there isn't an educational polarization dynamic, and there also is not a gender dynamic. I think the thing that happens, though, and this is why I'm focusing so much of the Realignment's next era and Alvin and Niskanen into the lens of storytelling, is I actually think like the prime issue is genuinely the stories and sort of like the expectations that stories give us that people bring to work in the space. So once again, if you are if you're a right of center funder, and I'm not going to like give too many details here, but like, let me put it this way. Like when I went to the office of the person who funded the Realignment, there were pictures of Buckley and Reagan and FDR and David Ben-Gurion. Okay, like those types of figures, like being in your space, being the people who you surround your office with, that says a little something about your model of greatness, of ambition, of like frankly the role of the individual in history and politics. And given that sort of, I'd say like civilizational Western civ, the classics kind of background, and then when you combine that with the story of the modern conservative movement being about very specific figures like Ayn Rand, William F. Buckley, Ronald Reagan, Barry Goldwater, the conscience of a conservative, these stories are so individualistically focused that it's actually pretty easy for you as a right of center donor just to say to yourself, okay, I don't think William F. Buckley had a theory of change or metrics that he could offer when he wrote God and Man at Yale or when he launched National Review. All that mattered is that during this moment of history when conservatism was up for grabs, he launched this publication and he led this movement. That's a story. Like that's a dynamic there. I think if you're a left of center person, though, I think a real critique of the left of center of it I have is that it's so disinterested in like the human factor in the individual and theories of change and metrics that it doesn't just focus on the fact of like, hey, like JD Vance was this random dude in 2014 no one had ever heard of. Yet Peter Thiel met him at a Yale Law School event, and now he's vice president and has a 50% chance of being president or maybe higher in 2028. That just happened. That's an individual, like that's a thing. Left of center people don't behave in a similar manner, and it's a real like frustrating dynamic.
Okay. Do you think that, so like maybe people on the left, they focus too little on individual stories and too much on like the structural factors like surrounding it, whether it be like the economic data or just like, yeah, like, okay, so what theories do you have about why they over-index on like performance metrics compared to individuals?
So part of what my work is focused on, especially within Niskanen, is the idea that liberalism. So like a lot of people like to say that like, oh, it's the Democratic Party is broken or like American politics is broken. Like the answer that I've come to, this is why I'm glad I'm doing this now, not 2 years ago, is that American liberalism in the center left sense itself is fundamentally broken. And the Democratic Party isn't actually the vehicle that needs to be fixed to get us to the destination. It's actually American liberalism that needs to actually be fixed. And then we'll get to the destination we get to use your metaphor from earlier. And what I mean by that is like, a central advantage that conservatism has over liberalism right now is that conservative, if you talk to any conservative, like whether they're like, you know, my in-laws in South Carolina or, you know, your most like highbrow Trump admin official, ask them, do you identify more as a conservative or do you identify more as a Republican? What they are going to tell you, whether they're highbrow or lowbrow, lower middle class or like upper class, educated or not educated, is they're going to say I'm a conservative. And then I'm a Republican. Being a Republican is a vehicle for advancing my conservatism. So what's been really frustrating about the Democratic Party, or basically like this whole, like, how do we reform American politics after 2024 dynamic, is in so many of the organizations have focused their actual critique or their project around fixing the Democratic Party. Look, you know, as you're a little younger than me, but you have friends who've seen this, like people don't like political parties. So it's just strange to me that like if we're sitting in this, like let's say there's a big board meeting where we're debating what you do after 2024, I would say, look, guys, if you're making your mission, we're going to fix the Democratic Party, that's just not going to work because the Democratic Party is so unpopular right now that it's not going to be something that's going to really attract people or bring them in. And that B, the better version to do is like, what is the actual ideology that we're trying to correct for here? And how do we take that ideology and then transform it into something actually attractive? So I was on a call where like a very well-connected Democratic donor just sort of said like, hey, like I don't like MAGA, but something I really like about MAGA is that it gave people, when the Republican Party was deeply unpopular and out of power and seemed to have no path forward in 2014, an alternate vehicle for supporting the right and Donald Trump. That is brilliant. That is very, very accurate. I think that's what liberalism needs right now. So this was a long way of actually getting to your question, but what I'm basically saying here is that like my critique of center-left giving is that it's this overly technocratic, meritocracy-driven checking the boxes of metrics and data and graphs and budgets and check-ins, when if you actually think of like why liberalism itself has failed and has lost a lot of its credibility, it's because, you know, this, like there's a million different David Brooks style articles about how the meritocracy has failed. I think one of the things that liberalism is going to have to basically work out is that the past 50 years, the liberal project has been about making things more technocratic, making things more empirically driven, making things more sort of think tanky and celebratory, and actually people hate it. I don't think people who are in that system are having a good time. I don't think people who are cut out of that system are having a good time. No one's actually happy with it. So one of the things that I think needs to actually happen here is that the way you're going to fix center-left giving is actually say to yourselves, hey, actually, what is liberalism trying to do? And then if we think what liberalism is trying to do, that would actually help us actually come up with a better answer of like, okay, like what should we be funding to actually make that vision happen? And I think the things that need to change about liberalism are not going to be like advanced through like metrics and theory of change and budgets and those different things. So that's the way I kind of get to that.
But isn't like the point of the abundance agenda to make things even more performance metric based? Like, you know, that whole thing about like how abundance prizes outcomes over procedures, but those outcomes are still going to be measured by empirical data, and they're still going to be analyzed by policy wonks who are saying the same like really nerdy things that just like go like fly over the heads of normal people. Like how do you know that you're not like continuing to go down the path of like yet another agenda that is yet another like product of the exact thing that you're critiquing?
Okay, here's a perfect example. So something I'm really obsessed with is like the era of the arsenal of democracy when the U.S. armed itself prior to and during the lead up and entrance into World War II. FDR gave a speech in 1939 where he said the U.S. is only producing thousands of airplanes a year. We need to achieve 50,000 planes a year. We got that done in 3 years. That's not technocracy. That's not over focus on procedure. That's actually just being a leader who sets clear goals in plain spoken language and directs his government and his administration and people towards achieving that goal. So I don't think you have to, as an abundance politician, say to yourself, okay, everyone, so we're going to look at the Administrative Procedure Act and NEPA, and by using NEPA, we're going to reform it, blah, 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 blah. Screw that. That's not what we need. What we need is, and actually, I don't think anyone should be defining themselves as an abundance politician like when they're door knocking. My take is that, you know how like conservatism has 3 different stools? So there's the social con stool, and there's the fiscal conservative stool, and there's the foreign policy hawk stool. I think abundance is a stool of liberalism, of this like project we're trying to figure out and basically build here. So what I think would actually matter as a politician is I would like a liberal politician to say, hey, I wouldn't quite use this stilted language, but if I was talking to a bunch of like 20 and 30 somethings and say, hey, I'm just going to take a guess. If I were to talk to all of you about something you see as absent from your life right now, it's like the chance of actually owning a home. And that's why you're thinking about like Blackstone or BlackRock supposedly buying houses. That's why you're like renting forever. That's why you're not settling down with a family, because you think this just isn't achievable for you. I'm actually a person who's going to make sure you have homes and you can get your slice of the American dream. So once again, there's like a better, more if I were doing this politician-y like 365 days a year, I could do a better version of that. But like, that's not talking about NEPA. That's not talking about procedure. That is just saying like, here is a goal. It aligns with your critique of the world and the status quo right now. I'm going to do something about that that's going to make a difference. And frankly, ask me something you really, really, really believe. So frankly, what I would do here too, and this is where both politics and performance matters, I wouldn't even start by saying, so listen up, you Zoomers. I'm guessing that you guys don't feel like you have a dream right now. Let me tell you your dream. It's like, no, I'd actually start by saying like, hey, real talk, I'm here to listen. Like, what does the American dream mean to you? What do you feel like isn't working for you? Why do you see a poll that says that basically like less than 10% of your generation feels like things are working out? Why do you guys feel that? And then what I suspect, because you should be like sort of in the discourse, you should get the deal is, I think like a home and a career and the precarity of where life feels like right now is going to play a huge part in that. And it's my job to answer those concerns with a version of liberalism that's informed by the abundance agenda. That's the version of like what I think this politics needs to look like.
Okay, I will admit that even if that is just like a first draft of what a politician should say, it is a much better first draft on pitching it to people than I've heard a lot of people describe abundance with.
It's almost like we shouldn't be paying people who Substack and blog all day, because look, we're getting personal in this podcast. Like this is like why it really matters. So I'm in a weird position at a career level, because it's really funny that I work at a think tank, because like I didn't get good grades in college. I was not academically inclined. I'm not going to grad school. But, when I was in, I say this on the podcast, like my friends are talking, you know this from like having friends who listen, you tend as a podcaster to sort of like have this shtick you repeat. And then people sort of like, if they listen to the podcast, they're like, oh, Marshall's saying it again, or oh, Andrew's saying it again. The thing that I always say is, back in high school, I was a politician kid. I was youth governor of Oregon. I was state champion student Congress. I went to Boys Nation. I was most likely to be president in my high school class. And I keep saying that, not in the sense that I'm interested in bragging because I'm 33 years old. If I'm still 18 years later talking about that stuff, you should probably like smack me upside the head. I talk about that because I'm trying to signal, this is me like not speaking directly. And you're inspiring me to speak more directly about this. The thing that's actually really wild for me, right, is that like the type of politician type that I'm describing is like a very specific type of person, right? Who's like in high school, like doing these things. And you know what's crazy, Andrew? Like, see, you've been in Canada, so maybe you may not notice this, but what's so wild to me is how few of my like peers from these programs are present in like Democratic Party politics right now, right? Like in this 30-something cohort. And this is what I kind of speak about with like, there's a lack of inclusion. The people who are over-indexed to it. So like, what I mean by this is like, these are people who like are voted to be class president or like have leadership skills. Maybe they're the quarterback of their high school team. Like a lot of people in these cohorts were like much better at this than I was. Like coming from Oregon, it's a smaller state. So like the dudes from like Texas and New York were 10 times more impressive than me. But I just like, if you follow people on Facebook or Instagram, like I never see them in any of these worlds. Like I never see them in the rooms. And the people I tend to see in the room tend to be staffer types. So people who came to DC when they were 22 or worked on campaigns or pundits and Substack bloggers. And I think those types of people, while important, are just like so not capable of, I think, the leadershipy things that you need to do to get these things done. I think they get in fights on Twitter too much. I think there's like a disagreeableness to their personality that people find off-putting. And I obviously like need to work on the degree to which I get overly wonky sometimes, but just I think just because my basis is that like I'm a politician type who's found myself in wonky academic world, I still am able to give like a better version of this abundance pitch than like another person would, because I'm just not like a Substack blogger who gets in fights with people all day. And it's very frustrating the Democratic Party politics like over indexes on this. And just like make this very clear to people. This is another reason why I think the right is much better at this. Like when you're sitting as a mid-20-something on the right in like a conservative academic seminar, like funded by these foundations, what they are so good at doing, and this also stems from the Buckley story, is they'll say like, some of you are writers. Others of you are opera research type. Others of you are campaign operators. Some of you are going to be chief of staff on the Hill. Others will run for office. Some of you aren't great writers, but you're going to be a publisher of National Review or the Weekly Standard or the Washington Free Beacon someday, right? Like the right has such a strong model of how there are different types of people in an ecosystem who do different things. And on the right, like those sort of like boys nation youth governor types are clearly directed towards the like you're a political actor type or you're going to be a pundit type. Like that's clearly where you're pushed.
Wait, you mean on the left?
No, on the right, like they're good at like sort of segmenting those people towards like you're either, let me put it this way, like they treat people like that like talent. So like you're going to run for office or you're going to be a pundit or you're going to do those types of things. On the left, when you spend times in these spaces, they are so over-indexed on, and this is where technocracy is part of the problem. One of the real problems with sort of the Obama era liberalism is that the Vox explainer became such a sort of like rubric for like, if you're like a smart young person, you're a writer and you could write like a blog. Like the thing about like Matt Yglesias and Noah Smith and like Derek Thompson, all these guys, is their ability to write 800 words on a complicated topic in a short period of time. And they get lots of people to pay them. It's genuinely incredible. But what I just notice is that archetype of a person has been so over-indexed on and is so over-rewarded because in a certain sense, it's like the apex of like technocratic dinner party, like DC liberalism, that they have no focus on like, hey, like, just so you know, that Substacker may be incredibly talented at that thing, but you know what they're really like not good at? They're really not good at talking to people who disagree with them, because the thing they do is they find people who disagree with them and they argue very aggressively. So like the funny thing about this is like I do a lot of work with like abundance critics on the left, and what they're always telling me is like, oh, I could work with you, Marshall. Like you're fine. Like, you know, you and Steve Talley's are fine. It's like these like annoying like these Substackers that we really beef with. And what I'll tell them is like, yeah, you could work with me because like I'm a different type of person than a Substacker is. And it's not good that so much of the abundance movement is primarily about, obviously the fact that Substackers get attention is actually like really, really, really important. But by over-indexing on attention, left liberalism has not done a good enough job of building a full spectrum of like individuals and leadership types and ecosystem types who can actually build movements and do things. Oh, and the one other thing, I know I'm ranting, but like, sorry, these are my favorite topics and you study them as much as I do, so I'll take opportunity to do so. The other type of thing the left over-indexes on, you're either a blogger or you're an activist or Gen Z activist. They super over-index on like protest types, the David Hoggs of the world, the March for Our Lives people. I get why they do it, but like those are the two categories of people who were rewarded within center-left politics versus the leadership types are the ones who are emailing me saying, hey, no one's talking to me and is giving me any opportunity to interact or engage with this project.
There's a quote from the Daniel Lee Thompson that you made. So just to quote you, you said, quote, unless you are quite literally running for Congress right now in a moderate swing district, or you have money or you can write, the center-left liberal establishment quite literally has nothing for you to do, end quote. What are some types of people that you think need to exist more in left-wing spaces?
So we need to be very precise. You said left wing. I would say center left spaces.
Okay,
because,
fine.
Because this, and it's funny, like everyone's parents listens to their podcast, and something my dad really beats with is when I'm delineating between the center and the center left and the left of center left and the populist left. I actually think in these terms, because these are specific worlds with actual individuals, I like being very specific. So I'm talking about the center left here. I think the center left. Actually, no. Here's a perfect example and way to think about this. So I think the center left is actually no. But this is the piece. This is the piece that I'm working on. That by speaking on your podcast about, I will force myself to do. I want to write a piece called "Liberalism Needs Leaders, Not Pundits," because if you look at the argument, if you look at some of the things that Searchlight, the new sort of center-left institute, have put out, they're all focused on we need ideas, we need to write pieces, and we need to blog, we need to put this stuff out there, we need podcasters, we need attention. I think what ultimately that just misses is that ideas, quote unquote, really matter when they have the right messenger delivering them, or the right person who could sit in a place like Nebraska or Maine or California or Oregon and translate those ideas into something that actually means something to people. And what I just see missing is, I think there's a generation, and this is why I just talk about my aging quarterback relationship with high school student government. I see so many people who are so talented at the leadership side of this thing, and I don't see any example of the center left saying, okay, great, we've invested in all these ideas, or actual people that no one's actually heard of, that we need to both, by dint of their different backgrounds and experiences, they could actually contribute to what this project is, but also it has something to say. There's no example that I could kind of identify of Peter Thiel meeting J.D. Vance in 2014 and then literally building an entire world for him. That is what I see lacking. And if I could just sort of, my personality means that I will never be a billionaire, and I'm very okay with that. But if I were a billionaire, the thing that I would actually just do right now is I would create a center left to left version of American Compass that basically said, hey, are you a under 40 something who identifies with center left to left liberalism and needs there to be something new? We want to build this democratic project that wants you to be a part of it. Let's go do this together, right? Think of think of Andrew Yang and his Forward Party, basically what Forward Party should have been instead of this sort of silly thing it turned into. So I think that I just go, what's frustrating for me is when I go into most center left spaces, I see a lot of wonks, I see a lot of staffer types, I see a lot of donors, I don't see many actual leaders, and that's very, very frustrating. Unless those leaders are actually elected already. So the member of Congress gets to be there, right? The governor gets to be there. But what I'm just fascinated by is the whole point of the J.D. Vance story to me is that 10 years ago, no one knew who the heck this guy was. Now he's vice president. Who's the person saying right now there's 50 different J.D. Vances who could save American liberalism? Who's identifying them? And no one's doing that unless they say they're an activist who's going to organize a protest. It's very, very frustrating.
Do you think that there is something about liberalism, specifically center-left liberalism, that makes it inherently harder to always try to find the leader? Is there something about their personalities? Is it something about the way that they grew up? Is it something about what attracts them to becoming those boring center-left policy wonks that I would enjoy having nerdy conversations with them, but I'm sure that so many of them just the vast majority of Americans, rightly or wrongly, view them as out of touch. What are the bottlenecks? What's actually stopping any of this from happening?
So I think the bottleneck is storytelling, right? So this is my Danielle Lee Thompson episode was so important because Danielle and I both got a lot of outreach from funders and people about it. What we were basically talking about, and I also did this with Daniel Squadron of the States Forum earlier this summer. I think the bottleneck is a lack of proper articulation of the project in a way that would allow the ideas and the wonks and the donors to be productive, but also to invite in the right type of people. So what was really great, and was, again, this is why I was talking about what MAGA is at the start of the podcast. What's really great about MAGA is that MAGA says, hey, we're burning it down. Come help us build the next thing. Under Donald Trump's majestic leadership, right? Like, there's a cost to that. But that's basically the MAGA pitch. Like, that is an inclusionary, like, interesting project. Like, what's really funny about the realignment going from the right to the left is there are so many, like, people who, like, reached out to me about the podcast in 2019, 2020, because these were sort of, like, nerdy types who were, like, really following this realignment discourse before it was cool, who now have, like, big jobs in the Trump administration. It's actually kind of crazy. I'm really happy that I, like, pay attention to them because they sort of joined up. Like, there's no equivalent of this experience for center-left people. A center-left person interested in the realignment who started listening in 2019, and these people do exist, would not have found his way into a Kamala Harris administration if she'd won, or a Biden too if he'd won. There's just, like, a difference to the real project here. So what I really want to do, and what I hope to do more of Danielle, is just make very clear, like, hey guys, like, here's the deal. Donald Trump, by winning in 2024, actually burnt down or closed the door on the 50-year post-60s, like, liberal project. It's over. It's done. What we need to do now, and it also, part of why it's done, is that the way that Trump won, by improving his share of minority voters, by, like, taking inroads in, like, different areas, by labor union support for Democrats collapsing, he actually negated a lot of sort of the underlying assumptions of that, like, 50-year project. And I think Ezra, by the way, is starting to work on this by Ezra just saying 2008 was the culmination of American liberalism by Barack Obama's election. He offers, like, a good way of saying that, explaining this to people in Norway, which is basically like, look, for 50 years, we were basically trying to get Obama elected. Now that was done, we ran into this era where Trump updated the Republican Party. He changed things during an era of disruption and revolt. And now that, like, it was proven that Biden just couldn't bring things back to the way they were before, now things actually have to change. And now we need to create a new project, a new liberal project that could actually build, like, a future for America that gets us out of the Trump years. Like, that is it. But here's the thing, though. Not once have I said the Democratic Party. I'm talking about liberalism. And this is, once again, this is the way the conservatives speak. Conservatives said, like, the thing that got me interested in the right, and this is why I'm speaking about what conservatives said, is in 2040, it's like, reform conservatism. Like, we're going to remake the right. You have to start with, like, remaking the underlying ideology and worldview. And then once you've done that, if you're successful and you can build something unifying and majority building, you then take over the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is the last thing that really matters. That's why it was so frustrating to see people fighting over who got to be vice chair, or who was on this panel, what percentage of minority to women voters are on this panel. That isn't the project. The project is liberalism itself, because that is what the right actually did. The right remade conservatism, and that by default remade the GOP. I don't see the same focus on the left.
Wait. Okay. There was something that you said at the very tail end of that answer that I want to expand on. Like, they were so focused on concerns that you said didn't matter. Like, they were so focused on, like, making sure that, like, people were, like, the right person ended up being the vice chair. Like, they were doing the right politicking, or, like, trying to make sure that, like, the right percentage of minority women were, like, being represented in this room. Talk about that. Like, what are they?
So what I'm speaking specifically about is that wasn't me just doing, like, anti-woke signaling, but, like, think of, like, why David Hogg's vice chair selection was, like, overturned. It's because there was an actual procedure for representation and gender diversity that wasn't, like, followed to. And aside from that, like, my actual answer is, like, who cares who the vice chair of the Democratic Party is? It didn't matter who the vice chair of the Republican Party in 2013 was. I think there's been way too much focus on just, like, the obvious and the straightforward. And that's what I'm kind of, like, actually getting at.
Yeah. So, but, like, I want to know, like, what specific concerns do you think the liberal establishment cares about way too much relative to what they should be caring about? And feel free to be as blunt as you can, like, as you want to be when you're doing the end. Like, obviously, authenticity is important. Don't sound like you're like speaking through a filter.
I think at a core level, and this is why I said, like, I identify with populism. I think the center left is just too comfortable and focused on preserving their own personal prerogatives and kind of the way things are because they worked for themselves. I don't think the center left is good at questioning a system that most people don't think is actually working. And I think that when you're actually questioning a system at a serious level, you get to way different answers than you actually get. So I think the second you spend your time saying, hey, wait a second, what's the actual story we're telling here? You're like, oh, wait a second, this Democratic Party story is a disaster. Versus like, if you're a staffer or you're just trying to get a job at your next think tank, like you're just not going to do that. That is just like the consistent like trait that I've seen across all these spaces.
How do you know that if you're not part of the establishment and like you see that the system hasn't been doing well for you, how do you know that the story that it would cause them to support would be like rent control or just like bad economic policies? Like, how do you know that that's not the case?
So this is where, people accuse me of being cynical and they misread my cynicism because I could be very, nope, that's not going to work, or this works or this doesn't work. It makes me more confident that there's like a path through, that there's a way through all of this, that there's kind of a way through the wilderness in this sense. And I think the way that I like to think about this is, rent control isn't going to fix the housing crisis. It's just not, right? So like at a baseline level, rent control isn't going to fix the actual problem that we're confronting here. So I think at a core level, at a certain point, you have to be confident that you're correct. Like you have to be confident that like, hey, like a huge problem in the city of Austin right now is that there aren't enough starter homes for people. So there's like this whole entry level of home buying or home renting that doesn't exist. And obviously rent control doesn't exist for that. And if I think of storytelling and political debate, because there needs to be more political debate on the center left, like one of the most annoying dynamics that happens is when you know us from the Realignment, I actually have a lot of like anti-abundance populists on the show to talk about the Realignment. And I get all these centrists being like, what are you doing debating with them? They're wrong. This is a waste of time. And this is where my politician side comes up, where I'm sort of just like, hey, like actually, if there's a central critique that any single person has of like the abundant center left, is that it's like smug and overly convinced that it's right about everything. So don't you guys realize about me actually having people on in good faith who disagree with me? I'm making very, very, very clear that like I could take criticism, but I'm willing to like talk about awkward truths and get into things. So I guess my real point here is that like we should be comfortable with debate. And I think that like what I'm comfortable about is if you actually sort of sat down a rent control person and a abundance person in my sense, and we had like a big debate of, let's say, all the millennials, and we talked about like what our end state looks like, here's what the rent control people are going to do. They are going to say like, hey, guess what? If you right now have an apartment, we are going to make sure that you will not have your rent increase. We're going to give you rent control. Instead, what an abundance person would say is like, hey, sure, that may help this specific person, but let's talk about the broader destination we're trying to get to here. Rent control isn't going to build those starter homes that you may want because, hey, I know my friends in Austin have said this. It's funny. There's a friend of mine, I won't name names here, but this is how like I actually engage in politics outside of Austin. I mean, inside Austin, outside of DC. A buddy of mine was saying he's getting married soon. And he was bummed out because he and his fiance had started to argue about like where they're going to move in the city because she is in her late 20s and she still wants to live near downtown Austin. And he's like, no, I want to buy a house. And the only houses we afford are going to be like 30, 40 minutes outside of the city. And she's like, okay, so I won't just like rent in the city then. He's like, no, but I want to own something. That story comes down to the fact that there is not enough starter homes, 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom homes to buy in Austin. So like by talking about them, once again, I could do a better politician version of this, but like the dynamic that I'm describing via telling that story, that abundance story makes clear how limited the rent control story is. But I don't think like your average millennial or Gen Z is looking to rent the rest of their life. Most of the reason my rent is just so core to everything is in New York City, the only option you have is you rent. So obviously in that version, but put it this way, I would not want to get into a rent control discussion in New York because that's just sort of like apex of the underlying dynamics. But like in any other city, I would basically say, I would take your language, which is very helpful, is talk about like the destination. I want us to have an Austin or a San Francisco or Portland, Oregon, where I grew up, where you can buy a home if you want to buy a home, or if you want to buy or if you want to live in a city and have a little small large, you can get a home. Or if you want to start and live in the city for 5 years, then once you have 2 kids go out to the suburbs, you could do that too. Like that is about talking about the destination, and that's why that's so critical.
Okay, So this is going to be one of my final questions. So you like just to circle back to something we said much, much earlier on in the podcast about all those emails that you got from your listeners, just like asking you for something to do. Like, did you answer any of those emails? Did you like give any of those people advice about what they could do?
So I actually didn't. So what I did is I did a lot of calls with people, and because this sort of goes to like my sort of career strategy, I just actually heard them out and asked like, what do you want to do? Why? Basically, I was this is my politician side. I didn't have anything for them to do. I want to think of events and convenings and gatherings and new orgs potentially they could offer them something. But I actually just like heard people out. And I think that's something that also like center left spaces are just like very bad at. If you look at sort of a lot of like the Dem reform organizations, you get the sense that like the POV they're looking for is for like wonky McWonk with a PhD from Blake University to like give their thoughts, or like ex-Hill staff or ex-Biden administration official. There's like no sense for any of these people they could contribute anything. So I just like talking to people. I'm always down to get coffee with people when I'm in their city, down to meet up with people in Austin. I just think hearing people out is actually the thing you need to really do right now. And not, by the way, in like a focus group sense, because I don't like focus groups. I think this is another unhelpful centrist take of sort of like, we met with 100 voters and they told us, like, no. Like, I don't think focus groups are actually like acts of listening. I just like take calls and sort of like, hey, like, how do you feel about this moment right now? What's missing? Blah, 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 blah. So that's how I think about it.
All right. So like, let's say that there was an analogous listener to this podcast constantly thinking to themselves, like, what can I do to like help out with this situation where they're horrified when they read the news and they wish that the center-left establishment had more stuff for them to do. What would you tell them if you could talk to them directly?
I would say the most important thing, and this speaks to what's missing right now, is the right and the left populists have a lot of bodies. There's events, there are meetups, there are gatherings, there are get-togethers. The center left does big protests like No Kings, but those are very like boomer coded and like aren't quite the same thing. So what I would actually advocate for, like speaking of like my Philly friend who I mentioned on the podcast earlier, I would say, hey, you should core those like 5 or 10 people and reach out to a candidate or a person in Philly or a think tank person who's in Philly, or like someone who's coming through the city and say you want to talk with them, like organize. That's basically like my answer. I think there's like a right 5,000 to 10,000 people who are center left and are millennial and Gen Z who should meet together and discourse and just build a community. And that's what's just like missing right now. And once again, this doesn't cost any money. Like, this is also why I said like there's just a flaw, sort of like my answer is not like Marsha's going to launch young center left leaders for tomorrow with a $30 million budget. Like, no, screw that. Like, that's not helpful. I actually think people should just like actually organize and get together. And maybe like to my friend, and I'll be sure to reach out to them after this podcast, who had these like 5 to 10 friends, like I'd love to meet them. I'd love to talk with them. Like, what's their deal? Because I think that's what's really missing here.
Yeah, I do remember one of the things that you mentioned earlier is that you hope that like liberals would be much better at community organizing and like giving people things to do. So my hope is that maybe several months from now, or like whenever we talk again, like the next time I ask you that, you'll have like an even more straightforward answer of like, go to this organization in your local place for XYZ reason, because like people in the center left liberal establishment let's hope that in the next few months they get much, much better at organizing and much, much better at giving people things to do.
Yep.
Yeah. Marshall Kosloff, thank you so much for taking the time to finally come onto this podcast.
And once again, Andrew, I apologize for my rudeness or for lack of response, but I think this is a better version of the podcast than you would have gotten 2 years ago. So thank you for having me on the show.
Appreciate it. Thank you for listening. If you like the episode, make sure to follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else that you get your podcasts from. Until next time. Actually, you know what? Screw it. Just stop the music. Stop the music right now. I need to make an announcement for those of you that are still listening. If you're just because here's the truth. I made a joke earlier during the recording when I I was like needling Marshall a little bit because he got rid of the really cool intro music in his podcast. I joked that like, oh, I wish that I had a sponsorship for like a podcast editing software to help Marshall get his old theme music back. Okay, here's the truth. I lied. Like, the truth is that I actually do have a podcast sponsorship, and I was afraid of telling it to Marshall because I thought it would be really, really cringy if I just like interrupted the recording to like plug some random sponsorship. But I have a sponsorship, and if you're listening to this and you're just like, oh, he's just taking the time to promote himself, this is why I included the plug at the very end of the podcast. If you don't want to hear me just giving like a random sponsorship for like podcast software, you can just skip to whatever the next episode in your feed is. But to the few of you that still want to hear my announcement, so there's like a podcast software that I was trying to recommend Marshall, where it doesn't just do editing. It's essentially a podcast recording software and a podcast editing software and an audio cleanup software and a publishing software and like a transcript generation software all at the same time. You pay a set amount every month, and then it automatically can do things like record for you and edit for you and create transcripts and like clean up the audio and publish and so on and so forth. And it does it in a way that is automated. It uses AI to take transcript generation or the editing process or the recording process and make it so much smoother than it would have been even 2 or 3 years ago. It is called All2, and basically, if you're part of the very, very small percentage of the audience that is interested in podcasting, but you don't know where to start, basically, if you click on the link in the description, or if you use the coupon PodStart, which I'll also link in the description, then you'll get 50% off your first month. I don't actually know how large of an audience there is, like within my audience, that is interested in making a podcast but doesn't know where to start, or they just want like a simpler and shorter editing times. But if you're part of that vast minority, or if you're Marshall Kosloff, Marshall, if you're listening, please click on the link in the description so that you can go back to having cool intro music in your podcast again, instead of like having those intros that are just you monologuing without any music. Anyway, yeah, that's all I had to say. Okay, now I'm gonna play the music again. Yeah, imagine that this is like a neat little outro to the end of the episode, and I hope you have a nice day.